Okay, so picking up where we left off, I just want to show you really quickly. One thing I did do from the last video is I didn't really care for the way that the type looked for the title where it says inspiration, and I did go ahead and if I click this, you can see that I changed it so just this part, the type part, for the title is size 66. It was much smaller with a really large letter spacing. I think it was like maybe 4.5 or something for the letter spacing. And I instead decided to make the type size larger at 66 and the letter spacing a lot smaller. And I think it ended up looking better. So if it looks a little different from the last video, that's why. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to maybe put an icon here of myself. So I'm going to go and go up here to File, Import, and I can say Import to Stage or Import to Library. Either one is fine. So let's just see first if we import it to the library, what happens. And I'm going to go into my desktop to my Animate CC project folder. And if you look at where we had saved a bunch of our image assets before, right, if you did it like I did it, then the file that you want to import is going to be located somewhere in your image assets. Now, everything seems sort of grayed out except for this practice SWIFT. That's because down here where it says enable, it gives me all these different file types that I can enable. I could say all files and then everything would show up. I could also pick the specific type of file that I wanted, like a JPEG or something. I'm just going to say all files because I might want a PNG, I might want a JPEG. All right, so then I can look and see what I've got here, and we could make a decision maybe to pick, let's just do a couple of different things. Let's pick this masked. I don't care about the drop shadow so much because it's going to be on black, but whatever. I could also just pick the one that already has a stroke attached to it, for instance. Okay. Um, and the plain one is the one that says Lee Color 500 masked, just regular. But if you remember, we made one that had a stroke and a drop shadow on it. So I can click this and then say open. And then it doesn't seem like anything happened, right? Well, if I look at my library, you can see that I have a couple of things. One is that I've got my Oswald that we had made before that was added to the library as an embedded font. But also now I've got this symbol, and you can see kind of what happens, and it looks sort of like the stroke doesn't look so great here. Let's just see what happens if we drag it to the stage, and it looks a lot better. But if we scale it down, let's see, maybe this stroke isn't going to scale so well. So I can click on the free transform tool, and I can scale it, and it actually looks a whole lot better here than it does up in this preview, which is a little odd and wonky, right? And so I can scale it down. And so this is one where I had already cropped it in Photoshop, for instance, right? So you could kind of figure out how big you wanted that icon. This might be the arrangement that you want, it might not be. It just kind of depends on what you're looking for. All right, so that's one option. Okay, another option would be if I wanted to drag it, or excuse me, import it straight to the stage. So I'm going to delete this from the stage, but you can still see that I have my original asset over here. So let's take a look and see what happens if we, here, go up here and say File, Import, and we'll say Import to Stage this time. And this time let's choose something a little bit different. I'm going to choose the one that is called Lee Color 500 Cropped, and it's cropped, it's not masked, okay? So I'm just going to choose the one that's cropped. And the reason I'm going to do that, okay, and it just takes it straight to the stage, is because I wanted to show you two different ways of looking at this. You could either pull something in directly like this, all right, and then I can scale it down to whatever size I want. And I can pull something in directly, and then I can also mask it in Flash or in Animate. And before I told you when I was doing the Photoshop demo, you can either go ahead and create your mask stuff in Photoshop if that's easier for you, or I can show you how to do it in Flash. So I'll show you how to do it in Flash. And you might find that, you know, it's an easier process to do it in Photoshop, especially if you're already familiar with it. So let's take this picture here, all right, and let's, you'll notice over here, we've got these different names, so I'm just going to leave them exactly the way they are. And I'm going to go ahead and get this to be approximately the size that I think that I'm going to want it. So maybe something like that. And I can always change this around if I want the byline to be different. Um, and the size of this is actually not going to be that different. So you might actually figure out, you know, hey, do I like it like this, or would I prefer that it actually have the byline next to it? And so you could kind of play around with that. And this is where maybe you would want to change the byline. The other thing too that I want you to notice that happened is when I imported that directly to the stage, it automatically put it inside of my layer that was available. So if I didn't want this in the same layer as the title byline, then I can just cut this. All right, so I'm going to literally cut it with Command X or Control X, and it's no longer in my layers panel on frame 1. Okay, what I can do instead is I can create a new layer here, and I can call it headshot, like this, or whatever you want to call it, you know, however you want to title it. And the other thing I might want to do is I might play around after I paste this in. I might play around with changing the byline up. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and paste it again, and it puts it right back, and it keeps the size that whenever I did a cut, it keeps it at the size where I had cut it. Okay, so if I did want to change the byline around, what I can do is come up here to the text, and I'm going to go up here, and I'm going to I could either cut this and make it in its own separate thing. I can either do it that way. The other thing that I could do is, while I have text selected, I'm going to go over here to the properties, and I could highlight this part, and I could mess around with the margin. So like where it says spacing, if I wanted to pull it over so that I increase that left margin, right, I could do so. I could just keep on making it go. But look what happens. So it wraps then, okay? So if I wanted to set this back to 0, that clearly isn't going to work for me. So the other thing I could do to keep the rest of the margin in is I could increase the margin. Let's just take it up to, like, let's see what happens at 100. And you see that it jumps over. I could do like 150, for instance, and maybe that's not enough. Let's try 200. So you could keep on messing with it until you get it to be where you want it to be. All right, so that's one thing that you can do. All right, and then it gives me a little bit more room for me to overlap my picture right here if that's the way that you wanted it to be. All right, so you have some different options, and then, you know, something else that you could do too is you could come here and you could hit the return key so that it pops itself down. However you want to do that. Maybe that is a little bit too much spacing. So you could then come over here and monkey around with this where you're changing the line spacing. All right, so, and that's going to change it up above. So I'm going to undo that. So maybe what I would want to do here is change the line spacing so that I pull it up a little bit, okay? So that's another way that you can monkey around with that text to get it to orient itself where you want it to be with your picture. And then that way you can keep the title and the byline together so that you're not making them separate. If you wanted to keep them separate, that would be okay too. It's really up to you. You can just sort of play around with this. I'm just showing you some different ways that you can adjust it. Let's actually change that so that it's a little bit more in the center. And that seems like it might be okay. All right, and we can always go back and adjust it later. And now what we can do is we can take this and we can add the mask like I had mentioned before. So the way that you can add a mask inside of Flash, all right, is you can, let's go ahead and take our oval tool, all right, and I'm gonna draw on a new layer. This is important. I have to create a new layer that's on top of the headshot, and I'm gonna call it mask. Not mark. Let's try mask. Mask. And I'll say mask headshot. So I know that those two are supposed to go together. All right, now I can draw the circle by clicking and doing Option Shift to draw outwards. And let's say that that's the circle that I want to use, right? And what does matter is that it has a fill. Everywhere that there's a fill, that's where it's going to keep the information. So if I go now with my selection tool up here, the black one, and I go ahead. First of all, actually, before I do anything, I'm going to go ahead and lock the byline layer, the title and byline layer. That way, whenever I go to select like this, it doesn't also pick the inspiration layer. Now, something that I just noticed is that it has the stroke on there, that little fuzzy stroke, because that was the last one that I had selected. So if I wanted to click that stroke and get rid of it, I can. Right, so that stroke is now gone and that won't become part of my mask. And if you need to be able to see this better and more clarity, then let's go ahead and zoom in and make sure that my mask is going to fit properly. And it looks like it fits right up properly up to the edges. So what I can do now is I can select both of these items. And remember, you got to make sure that you don't just select part of that circle because it is actually a shape and it's not a drawing object. If you select it like this, you can go ahead and turn it into a drawing object so you don't accidentally select a portion of it. So we can try that. Now that's a drawing object, we'll select both of these together, and it is going to select both the headshot and the mask headshot. And what I can do is I can right click on down here in the layers, I can right click where I said mask headshot because it's on top, and I can say mask. And you see here that it goes ahead and it masks it for me. And if I zoom back out, I can see if I actually think that that's going to look good. And you can make that determination for yourself. Like for instance, if your name doesn't quite fit like this, you might want to monkey around with it. It might be like by and then a separate line is your name or something like that. It's really up to you. You can also change the scale of this type. Really, that's your decision here. So if I wanted to now move the mask, the problem is I can't move the mask because look what happened. As soon as I actually created the mask, it locked both of those layers. To be able to move the mask, I have to unlock them, but it's going to basically take the mask off. So if I needed to be able to take this and then, do something else with it, right, move it down here or whatever, then I would need to unlock that mask and move them as a group together by selecting them both. I'm going to undo that and I'll go ahead and lock this again, and then you see that it goes ahead and it remembers that it's supposed to be a mask. Okay, so one of the things that can be kind of challenging about creating a mask in Flash is that every time you want to move the thing, you got to unlock it, and it basically takes that apart. So that might be one reason that you might want to, for instance, import something into the library that's already masked and drop it in there. All right, so it's really up to you how you want to do that. Now, the other thing too is because I can't select that, it makes it a little bit more complicated for, turning it into a symbol and so forth. So if you needed to, for instance, make it into a button, the alternative would be that you could put basically a clear shape on top of it that could behave as a button so that it could seem like you're clicking that to make it link out maybe to, for instance, your website or your Facebook page or your YouTube channel, even better, right? So that it'll, people can see other things that you do. So we can look at how we can make that into a link later. Now, the other thing that might be nice about leaving this space down here blank is, like I said before, you could have a continuation of navigation once you take all of your individual pieces and parts and drop them into the same Flash file. You can have down here in the timeline a continuation of what's going to happen. For your navigation, but for right now, you don't necessarily need to put anything in there. Just make sure that your group has decided how that's going to look before you start designing all of this out. And you guys come up with a plan. Okay, now that we have that done, the other thing that I wanted to show you really quickly is I want to show you how you can convert this into a vector shape. So let's just blow this up a little bit. Let's go up to 100%. Okay, and I'm going to have to actually take the mask off of here. And what I'll do is I'll just, for right now, I'm going to make in the layer panel, click the little eyeball column for the mask shape so that I can actually see what I'm doing right here with my face. Okay, so let's go ahead and I'll keep this selected, and I can do something where I can either break it apart. So one of the things that you can do is you can right click and you can say break apart for a bitmap. And then what's kind of crazy is I can do all sorts of things to this. I could start to, you know, like select portions of it if I wanted. I could start to delete parts of it, just sort of like any other shape. Basically, it becomes a shape. If you look here in properties, you see that it's now a shape. It's no longer an object. I don't want to do that though. That's not how you vectorize it. I just wanted to show you that you could start to do that, right? So anyway, I'm going to take it back now. Let's go back in history. If I go up here to Window, I can go to my history component and I can scroll to the bottom, and let's just go ahead and drag that up and until we can see that it is no longer a shape. So let's go back up, see where it says break apart. We're going to go one past that. All right, and so now this is no longer, when I select it and I go to like drag a part of it, you can see now it goes back to being a bitmap in the properties. I just wanted to show you that you could break it apart and you could start to edit it that way. But if you want to go up here to modify while it's selected, where it says bitmap, I can say trace bitmap. Now it's going to give me some different options. I can preview it. All right, this is just the standard that it's settings that it's going to throw up here. Like, so I could change the threshold, like the color threshold, and preview it again. And you see it like actually gives me less information. I could change it down to like 30, and you can even see more of what it's going to start to do. Okay, and 30 actually gives me a whole lot more information, right? It becomes more almost like the real raster graphic. So like if I were to take it to like 140, for instance, let's do a preview, it's going to really blow it out like it's more posterized, right? And so if you guys decided that you wanted to have these vector looking images, you could do that. You could do them individually too if you wanted to kind of play around with this. But you know, you might consider actually doing it in such a way that it has some consistency. You can see that 120 with these other settings doesn't really work very well. It sort of knocks my nose out and makes me look a little bizarre. If I go over here to very smooth, do a preview, you can see it just smooths out some of the edges, right? We can change the minimum area, like see what happens when we do that. Anyway, you can start to really mess around with changing this into a vector in some way, shape, or form. So let's try something like 50. All right, it's taking a little bit longer. And I don't know, that might be, you know, kind of too much information, however you want to mess around with this, right? And the closer that you get to pixels, like very tight in pixels, it's going to make it look more like the actual raster graphic. So anyway, I'm going to let you play around with the way that you want that. I think that I am not going to vectorize mine, but I did want to show you that this is one of the ways that you can actually do it. And people have been doing this for a really long time, taking bitmaps and vectorizing them in Flash. And so I'll just leave that as a regular bitmap, okay? And now I can go back over here and I can turn my my headshot mask back on, and then I can lock it back in place. Now you might look at that and go, well, I liked having the stroke on there. So one of the other things that you could do is like where it says mask headshot down in the layers panel, I can duplicate this because remember what this is, all it is just a circle that's sort of perfectly the circle that I want. All right, so I'm going to basically take this and I am going to right click it, just the mask layer, and I'm going to say duplicate layers, excuse me. And you see that it doesn't really show anything because it's locked and it shows it as a mask layer. Well, if I turn off the lock, what it does is it shows me the circle. And what I can do to this mask layer is I can right click it and I can tell it to not be a mask by clicking mask. Because it's selected, I click it, it'll deselect it. And you see it turns back into a regular page icon or a layer icon. It no longer has the mask shape attached to it. And so I'm going to rename it and I'll call it stroke. And we can actually call it a headshot stroke. Okay, like that. And what I can do now is where I've got this fill, the problem is that if I click on this, like just select it again, I don't have the ability to add a stroke because remember I deleted it. And the reason I wanted to show you that is because that's going to happen a lot of times where you might think you don't need a stroke and you just want to get rid of it. Instead of changing the alpha of it to 0, and you actually delete it like that, then you might need to be able to add a stroke to something. So if you do, what you can come down in the tool panel and do is choose this ink bottle tool. And while the ink bottle tool is selected, I can look at my shape and I can try to add a stroke, right? But you'll notice that if I click on it, it doesn't really actually change any of the stroke information here. So that's a little bit confusing. One of the things that's going to make it a lot easier for you to apply it is if you change that shape into a drawing object. So remember, you can click on create object to change it into a drawing object as opposed to just a shape that's broken apart. And what you can do then is if I zoom in a lot more, you can see it better. There are these little vector, in fact, let's go even further. You can see, like, it might be kind of hard to see on your screen, but there are these little vector points right here. And if I click on that, watch what happens over here. You'll see that my stroke stuff becomes available now. And you need to get that with a lot of precision, basically by being able to click on that vector shape. And then if you wanted to go back and break it apart again, you can do that. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that it has a fill right now, but the stroke is transparent. So if I wanted to add a stroke, let's click here. And I can first turn the alpha all the way up to 100, and then so that I can actually see the color, let's just change it so that it's something more obvious like this blue color. Then I can also come over here to my fill and I can turn the alpha down, all the way. Or if you wanted to give something a tint, you could also do that, right? So I'm going to turn the alpha all the way down and you see I still get this grid. I didn't completely knock it out. Like if you knock it out here, you're basically going to just knock it out completely. It's like deleting it. You don't want to delete this. Okay, so now that I've got my stroke here, I can come over and let's choose, this was the color I made my text. And you can play with the stroke size. So if I go back down to, let's say 50, I can kind of see everything at once. And I can make sure my stage is centered. And if I click off of it, right, I can actually see how big the stroke is. And I think I'm probably okay with that. If I wasn't sure about it, I could select it and maybe try like 1.5 for my stroke size, something like that, and then click off, and then I can kind of see it better. And I think that that might be a good size for me. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to show you before we end this is that first of all, I clicked off of this and I just clicked on the stage background, and you'll notice that the properties updated. Now the other thing is, if I were doing this, I might keep going with this design of this section and kind of monkey around more with it. I encourage you to do so, but for brevity, I'm going to keep it this way. And what I'll do is I'll show you how you can publish this out as a Swift file. The placeholder is something that, the placeholder for video is something that is actually, not going to get used whenever if you're, putting this out for group export. So if everybody makes their Swift file, it'll allow for this data to just get added in to a larger project. But we don't need all of these placeholders. In fact, what we might want to do is just go ahead and turn off the visibility here. And you can kind of just see that this is what would end up getting sent out for us. And the other thing too that you could also look at just for the heck of it is whenever you choose this and you go over here to your title, I can, except we locked this, sorry. So I need to unlock my title byline. I can choose that. And one of the things you might also just take a peek at is the placement of it. So we see what the size is. That's not as important what the width and height is as much as it is what the X and Y positions are. And you could jot that down. And if you wanted to jot that down in some notes so that whenever later whoever is putting everything together in your group for the larger project, at least they'll know what your starting X and Y coordinates were so that it knows where these things can go. That's just a quick note for you. But anyway, what we can do is you can keep these unlocked or locked however you want, but then just make sure you turn off the visibility of the movie placeholder, and you'll go up here to File, and you'll go to Publish Settings. You can access it there, or also you can access the screen alternatively by just clicking on the stage somewhere, not on an object, but on the stage, and you'll see your Publish Settings button right here. So both of those are going to pull this up. Now, one of the things that by default you'll probably see is HTML wrapper is enabled, and you can enable it in an HTML wrapper if you want. I would recommend that you turn that off for right now, because what you'll see is that it creates an HTML file that you're really not going to use, not for just this part of your contribution, right? What you will be doing is exporting it out as a Flash Swift file, which is useful. And what you can do is click here where it says Flash Swift, and it shows you all of the Swift export options. And if I were you, what I would do is go and where it says include hidden layers, turn that off. And then that way it won't get that hidden movie poster, because the movie poster, basically the placeholder, is something that you don't, need to have a whole bunch of in in the final document, because they're all going to have to get deleted anyway. And you just need to know that some of these pieces, they're going to come in as imported symbols or imported elements to the new object whenever somebody, or the new file when somebody imports your Swift file to the larger project. So you can turn off hidden layers, and you want to keep access local files only. The reason I mention this is because if somebody's sitting down before you change this to network, you might have some problems. So anyway, you're going to click on these, and you can go ahead and publish it from here. And whenever you publish it, just click OK. It doesn't do anything dramatic, right? What it's going to do is, if you go to your file system, you'll see that it created a Cotner 2 Swift. And if we launch that, you'll see that it looks just like this. Okay, and this is basically a file that you can contribute to the group, so that everybody who's got one, basically they can later add the video here. Now, you can't really add your video here with embedded video and have it carry over in your Swift file. It doesn't really work very well like that. You have to add the video separately in the project, but you can at least do all of this work so that somebody else doesn't have to do that for you. And then as long as everybody sort of decides, hey, this is going to be consistent, everybody can kind of do it the same way. Additionally, you also don't need to add whatever the navigation is here, because you'll see later that that can be added very simply and carried through the timeline. So anyway, this is now the little Swift file that you could give to somebody. And if you wanted any kind of animations to happen here, you could. Like if you wanted, for instance, the word inspiration to change colors once. You don't want it to constantly happen, because you don't want it to detract from your movie. But maybe you want the word, the title of your document or the title of your piece to change. And you could create an animation or something like that. And you'll see in other future videos how you can actually animate stuff on the timeline. So, but that's separate from this.